Why in the world would I want to do an epic shootout on a camera that's been out for nearly 3 years compared to a brand new camera? The Canon 5D Mark III was announced in March of 2012. It features a 22 megapixel full-frame sensor, 61 focusing squares, 41 of which are cross-type. It shoots at a very respectable 6 frames per second, and it is an absolute workhorse for portrait and wedding photographers. The video guys also love the actual look and the quality of the images that they get out of it. For the cost of $3,300 to $3,400, depending on where you find it, and sometimes less, the Canon 5D Mark III can be yours. Since its release, I've been using the 5D Mark III in just about every production I have worked on. From my YouTube videos to my training DVDs, the Steadicam shots, I'm even using it to record this video right now. So even though it's a little bit older, it is very well known for being a tremendous performer. It can do many things very, very well. Nikon's recently released D750 is a very interesting camera for a number of reasons. It features a 24 megapixel sensor, has 51 focusing squares, 15 of which are cross-type, shoots at 6.5 frames per second, and it is absolutely loaded with features. The first obvious one is a tilting monitor, the first of its kind on full-frame Nikon cameras. It's not flippy, it's not touchy, it's just tilty. Still a very welcome addition. It has a built-in flash, built-in focus assist lamp, built-in intervalometer, built-in Wi-Fi. But the thing that makes it so attractive is that it offers all these features for $2,200 or $2,300 depending on where you get it, at least at the time of this recording. Now, even though we're about to spend a lot of time talking about two great cameras, the truth of the matter is the skill sets of the photographer are far more important than the actual camera they're using. If you don't know how to use your camera, it doesn't really matter which one you have. The reason I say this is I have awesome crash course tutorial training videos on both the Nikon D750 as well as the Canon 5D Mark III. I'll put the links in the description as well as at the end. If you're new to either of those cameras or just about any Canon or Nikon DSLR, I have a training video for you. I also have videos on speedlight, Photoshop, advanced techniques, all kinds of different topics. If you like what you see, you're definitely going to want to check them out. Something I'm trying to do in my Epic Shootouts is to present to you guys the very best information you can find anywhere in the world about two competing cameras. I know that's ambitious, probably crazy. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm getting closer. So if you guys like what you see, please subscribe to my channel, share the video with anybody that you might think is interested, and that tells me that we have a good thing going here. I put everything I can into the videos. They take anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, one video. Every time I do them, I tell myself I'm never going to do one of those again, but I get a lot of great feedback, and that's why I continue to do them. Very important to me to stay unbiased and to present to you data, things that you can measure, numbers, things that you can see, and judge for yourself to come to your own conclusions. I also present my methodology, how I am getting the results, so anybody watching this video can go out and repeat the test using the same methodology and pretty much come to the same conclusions that I do. Many of you have asked that I talk about the lenses that I use in these tests. Most of the time it's a 24 to 70 2.8 from the respective companies, though I do have a version 1 and version 2 for Canon that I use depending on what I'm shooting. For the astrophotography, I use the 14 to 24 2.8 for the Nikon and the 14mm 2.8 for Canon. In the portrait tests, I also included some 50mm 1.4 shots. The 3 Servo sports tests I wanted to perform were number 1, a side-to-side moving subject with the sun behind the shooter, number 2, a fast-moving forward subject with the sun to the shooter's back, number 3, a subject moving away from the shooter into heavy backlight. The plan was to shoot on the fastest burst speed that has continuous autofocus. I'll compose my subject on the far right or far left of the monitor, shoot on JPEG, count the out of focus shots, and determine an accuracy percentage based on the total number of shots taken. For side-to-side shooting, the D750 rated 91% with the Canon 5Diii scoring 94%. This makes sense because for side-to-side shooting, the depth of our subject doesn't change that much, and we would essentially call this a tie. When our subject is moving forward into heavy front light, the D750 scored 71%, and the Canon 5Diii Mark III still a very high 86%. When our subject runs into heavy backlight, the D750 scored 72%, and the Canon 5Diii Mark III a 77%. On initial glance of the data, it appears that the 5Diii Mark III has an advantage only when subjects are moving towards the camera in good light. But there's actually a little bit more to the story. I took the time to map the location of each focusing square for both cameras in order to compare their coverage as it relates to what we see through the viewfinder. The D750 features 51 focusing squares, with the central 15 being cross-type sensitive. The 5Diii Mark III has 61 focusing squares, 41 of which are cross-type, with a 3-pillar arrangement of those cross-type focusing squares. When we compare the position of the squares from both cameras, we see a few interesting things. Number one, the 5Diii Mark III has wider placement of its furthest focusing columns. Number two, the 5Diii Mark III has cross-type focusing squares where the D750's non-cross-type squares end. And number three, the 5Diii Mark III has 5 central dual cross-type focusing squares, which are typically considered as high precision. Now, while the outer and dual cross-type squares were not part of the sport's focusing test, it is a critical detail that many buyers would want to know about. It is my opinion that even while the focusing system in the 5Diii Mark III is better, for sports shooting using the furthest outside squares, I don't think most sports photographers are going to notice a huge difference in good lighting conditions. So what we're going to do now is a high-speed burst with JPEG and RAW, and we're just going to listen to hear when the camera starts to slow down. So first camera is the Nikon D750. I have both RAW and JPEG Fine turned on. Ready, go. So you can hear it slowing down. So it sounded like about 11 or 12 shots before it started slowing down. So same thing, 5Diii Mark III, both RAW and JPEG. All right, ready, go. So we can also hear the 5Diii Mark III start to slow down after just a few shots. One question that I've been getting from a lot of different users is why not do both JPEG and RAW as well as RAW? I'm going to do that for you guys right now. So we're going back to the D750. We're going to go to quality, and we're just going to have just RAW by itself. Ready, go. Okay, so this is just RAW on the 5Diii Mark III. Ready, go. So you can hear that both cameras do better with RAW only, but they still slow down. It's just, a lot of this is, we're gonna have to go back and actually count to see how well it does. For buffer performance, if you're shooting in JPEG and RAW together, the D750 seems to have an edge. If you are shooting in RAW only, the 5Diii Mark III has a very distinct advantage. Just keep in mind that the memory card that you use is going to come into play. Another test I like to perform is a camera's ability to focus in low light. The Nikon D750 is rated down to -3 exposure values, while the 5Diii Mark III is rated down to -2 EV. I like to do the tests without any focus assist lamp turned on, and I use the camera's central focusing squares. My methodology is outlined on my blog, but suffice it to say I have 2 high contrast targets at different distances and different brightnesses. I then focus back and forth for 30 repetitions, timing how long it takes for each camera to achieve 30 focus locks. If one camera consistently struggles to focus, it will take longer, and this is something we can easily see in the time differences. The most consistent and reproducible results I got was when I had the far target at 5.5 exposure values and the near target at negative 1.7 EV. On average, the D750 scored 77 seconds with the 5D Mark III at 75 seconds, essentially the same speed. Now there are a few really important side notes. Number one, Canon has updated its 5D Mark III firmware to fix a bug in its focusing capabilities. If you don't have this firmware installed, you can expect to see slower times. Number two, on some occasions I was able to get both cameras to focus past negative 2 EV, but the results were not consistent enough to measure. Without a focus assist lamp on, using the central focusing squares, both cameras perform equally well in low light. When we turn on the D750's auto focus assist lamp, its score drops down to an average of 41 seconds, a clear winner in that test as the 5D Mark III does not have a built-in autofocus assist lamp. For the JPEG ISO noise tests, I leave standard noise reduction turned on and increase the ISO and shutter speeds at one-stop intervals. At lower ISOs, both cameras perform comparably. When we get to an ISO of 6400, we start to see some important differences. Notice the grain on the green, red, and gray swatches on the camera on the right, but also take a look at the lighter shades of black and some of the grain we're starting to see there on the camera on the left. Now, as we get into higher ISOs, this becomes more pronounced, but the camera on the left, which is the Nikon D750, in my opinion, has an advantage by at least a half stop, possibly more. Many of you have been asking for a raw ISO test, so I decided to incorporate it into some astrophotography samples. It was not a great night for astrophotography due to high altitude clouds, but I did my best and I was still very impressed with the images from both cameras. I like to push my ISO past 3200 and 6400 for astrophotography shots because performance in this range can really make a world of difference when you're shooting in these conditions. I thought both cameras did great, but it was these side-by-side shots overlooking Maui's Valley that convinced me the D750 has an edge. In this single shot, we have part of the Milky Way, as well as the street lights below. Look at the difference in the quality of the noise in the clouds and the shadows in the lower parts of the image. For raw ISO performance in an astrophotography setting, the win here goes to the Nikon. For years, I've been trying to come up with a reliable, affordable, and reproducible way to measure a camera's dynamic range, which is the number of shades it can see from pure white to pure black. It's a very important characteristic for landscape photographers. Now, the methodology is going to be outlined in detail on my blog, but suffice it to say, I purchased a Stouffer transmission wedge. It's essentially 41 little ND filters on a transparent strip. I took that strip, installed it into a black poster board that I hung in front of an Alien B, which was double diffused so the light is nice and even. I then did some test shots and found the best exposure settings and flash power to clip out or overexpose the very first step of this transmission wedge. What that means is that is pure white and it is overexposed, and the remaining 40 steps are available for analysis. I then imported it into Camera Raw, increased the exposure to clip out the first step again because RAW files have more dynamic range, and then I squeezed the file open using the shadow slider. What I'm looking for is the point in when two adjacent steps are no longer differentiatable, when you can't see the difference between them. And then I compared the two wedges from the Canon and the Nikon. Now, there is a flaw with this test in that it doesn't really measure total dynamic range, but when we compare side by side, same exposure settings, same flash power, and we look at the results from either camera, it can tell us a lot. For example, when we look at the Canon result, somewhere around 32 to 33 or maybe even 33 to 34, it becomes very difficult to tell the difference between two of those steps. The Nikon performance was astonishing, both in dynamic range as well as the noise threshold. You're going to see there's not as much noise. These images were taken at ISO 100, so it should be very, very clean. But when we do the math and the difference, it's pretty easy to say that the Nikon has at least a 2-stop advantage over the Canon. For dynamic range performance, huge win for the D750. For video ISO noise, I like to record a candle and increase the ISO as well as the shutter speed in 1-stop increments. Take a look at the grain in the candle as well as the dark shadows surrounding it. Once we get into higher ISOs, we can see that the Canon has a distinct advantage, and once we get to 12,800, the ISO noise on the Nikon really falls apart. The win for ISO noise in video goes to the Canon. Rolling shutter is a video artifact. It's like jello when you're panning left or right, the sloshy movement of what should be vertical objects like buildings, or in this case, blinds. It's easy to see rolling shutter in both cameras. Morie is a splotchy, hazy artifact we see in textured patterns such as bricks, vegetation, or in this case, a horizontally lined shirt. Keep in mind, both cameras have the same exact exposure settings in auto white balance. The 5D Mark III has minimal moire, but it is there. You'll notice it in this classical radial pattern. On the D750, I see these vertical line artifacts, which is unusual because my shirt is horizontally lined. I've never seen it before on any Nikon camera, and this leads me to believe that the moire is being cleaned up through a new processing algorithm. This is a judgment call you're going to have to make on your own. Both cameras have a built-in HDR, or high dynamic range feature, that many photographers like to use if time is very limited. The D750's HDR is blazingly fast, literally just a second or two and it is ready to take the next shot. I was very impressed with its speed. When it works correctly, it'll take simply gorgeous shots. The problem was too often I would get images like this, where the horizon or the sky wouldn't line up and we would see these artifacts. The 5D Mark III also occasionally has artifacts and it takes a lot longer, several seconds, but I'm still declaring it the HDR winner for a few reasons. It was just more consistent, had fewer artifacts, and better results overall. It allows you to shoot in RAW and also saves those raw images, including the final HDR shot, which is a JPEG, but that allows you to have those images if you want to recreate it at home using more advanced software. The D750 only saves a single JPEG. Grab a pen and a piece of paper for this next test and list it from 1 to 12. Pause the video if you need some extra time. I'm going to show you a dozen side-by-side portrait images and just write down whether you like the left image or the right image more. And at the end of this little quiz, I'll show you the answers and you can see which image quality you prefer out of which camera. This is your personal opinion, so there's no right or no wrong answers here. It's just which one you like more. Now, I intentionally mix up and not label these as to remove any bias you might have towards one brand or the other. And this is also what I refer to as the image quality test, which is essentially what type of images each camera produces. If you score in much more favor one over the other, you're probably going to be more happy with that camera. If the scores are even, then it's probably not going to matter as much. Some important notes about this test. I used auto white balance in the standard portrait style for each shot. Each set that you see was shot with the same exact exposure settings, and I didn't Photoshop or adjust any of these images. This is straight out of the camera. We were a little bit pressed for time, but in the 2 hours we had, I tried to get as many different types of lighting shots possible, from harsh sunlight to backlight to shade to wide aperture, golden hour light, high ISO, post-sunset, you name it. Even when I personally take this test, I tend to have a preference towards one of the cameras despite some minor strange things that might be going on with color sampling and white balance. Most of the time that can be corrected. So are you ready for the answers? Here they are. Score which camera you liked more, and that will give you a really good indication of which image quality you prefer for portraits. Now, there are a number of little side notes I need to make about each of these cameras. Number one, something I definitely want to see in future Nikon and Canon cameras is 4K video. Neither one of these cameras will shoot in 4K. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in the conclusion. The 5D Mark III shoots at a maximum shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second versus 1/4,000th of a second for the Nikon. The ergonomics on the Nikon D750, the grip here is super narrow. You can see that my finger barely fits between the grip and the lens mount itself. And what this does is it feels like a lot of strain on your fingers. For whatever reason, the grip isn't quite as comfortable for me as it is on the 5D Mark III. Some people will disagree with me. It's just something I noticed. In terms of the live view, you can get exposure preview and change your aperture when you're in live view. That is a very welcome change. We don't see it in the lower Nikon DSLRs. The D750's Wi-Fi is very limited. You could really only preview your exposure, change your focus square, take the shot, download some images, and that's about it. You can't really change your exposure settings, at least yet, maybe in the future. And there's also a potential security flaw there. I'm sure it'll be fixed. Probably not a huge deal. Something that we see in the 5D Mark III is an all magnesium body, very important for certain types of shooters. We get a hybrid plastic magnesium carbon fiber body on the D750. For you event shooters, something you should be aware of is that while the RAW files are very comparable, the JPEGs are nearly twice the size in the Nikon. Probably not a huge deal, but if you deal with thousands of images, that might be something that's important. So in conclusion, which camera would I recommend to what kind of photographer? I think that anybody who's been watching this objectively, in all fairness, will probably come to the same conclusion that I did. For its awesome dynamic range, its wonderful ISO performance for stills, and most importantly, for the number of features that you are getting for the price, we have to call the Nikon D750 the winner in this Epic Shootout. It is a phenomenal camera that is not getting enough attention. I've read some reviews that say this is essentially a glorified D610. That's just not the case. Don't believe anybody who is saying this or telling you this. The D750 is an absolute home run winner. So who would I recommend the Canon 5D Mark III to? That is the $1,000 question. Now, obviously, there's going to be some shooters who have a lot of L glass. They've invested a lot into their lenses. It doesn't make a lot of sense to switch over. I'm not going to get into that discussion right now. But pro photographers, those of you who are shooting 2 or 3 times a week for a paycheck, wedding photographers who are shooting just about every weekend, the focusing system alone is enough reason to spend that extra money. I do know some people who will disagree with me, but anybody who has shot professionally knows the importance of the cross-type focusing squares. If you know where they are and you're using them, more of your shots are actually going to be in focus. That is critically important when you are dealing with a client that you only may have an hour or 2-hour window with, because the percentage of their shots in focus are going to go up. An example I can share with you was I was down at the beach after a sunset shoot. I had both cameras in my hands and these little crabs were popping up out of their holes. The 5D Mark III was more consistent and more accurate, more precise with its center focusing squares, which are dual cross type. So yeah, I do think the focusing systems are significantly better on the 5D Mark III. Even 3 years after its release, it is that good. Now, if you are primarily a video shooter, my recommendation would be to watch the Epic Shootout I produced on the A7S versus the GH4. Those are both mirrorless cameras, but for video work, they're absolutely phenomenal. I'll put the links in the description as well as at the end of this video. If you guys enjoy this Epic Shootout and you want to see more, definitely please subscribe to my channel and share the video with anyone you think might be interested. Clubs, forums, Facebook, You guys can share it anywhere you want. If you're interested in some behind the scenes looks, some of the Easter eggs of these Epic Shootouts, as well as some of the gear I am testing, definitely take a look for me on Instagram. I'm known there as Michael the Maven. I got a Canon 7D Mark II sitting right over there on the table. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see it compete against. I thank you guys so much for your support, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoy this Epic Shootout, you may be interested in my tutorial training videos on Canon and Nikon DSLRs. I have one for the D750 as well as the 5D Mark III and many other models that have come out within the last few years. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to shoot like a pro in no time. You can order them from the following link.